Thanks, Ernst. Well, it's great to be here with everyone today. So I want to address our main topic today about the importance of culture by introducing you to some work, as Ernst mentioned, that comes from the book I've recently submitted to my editor and publisher. And I'm going to open this by focusing on two puzzles. The first is the puzzle of weird psychology. So Ernst made reference to weird. So weird is an acronym. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And the puzzle I came across, so this is kind of a hidden puzzle. Most people wouldn't be familiar with this. I first kind of unearthed this puzzle when I was collaborating with two cultural psychologists, Ara Noren-Zion and Steve Heine, and we began to assemble all of the experimental psychological evidence that had been done across diverse societies. And what we noticed was not only had psychologists and behavioral economists been studying one slice of a large cake of cultural diversity, but a particularly unusual group, a group that anchored the end of the distribution. Even more concerning was the fact that 96% of all subjects in behavioral economics, experimental economics, or psychology come from this psychologically peculiar population. We labeled this group weird to capture the essence of it. And we can trace down variation in perception, differences in memory, motivation, so very fundamental aspects of psychology. So the thing that I really want to focus on today is a set of ideas about how Westerners became psychologically unusual. And I want to link that to the puzzle that's perhaps of more general interest. It's the old puzzle. It's the puzzle of Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. So how is it that sometime around the middle of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution lurches out of the English Midlands and gradually trundles across Europe and eventually across the world, globalization that's now occurring. So the case that I'll be making, and I'm not going to say too much about the economic sides other than to genuflect in the direction of this from time to time, but there's a link that can be made once the psychology begins to change in particular ways. We've already seen a bunch of them. It makes it much easier to build the kinds of institutions and to generate the relentless innovation that's necessary for the Industrial Revolution and ongoing economic growth. So what I want to do first is to give you a very bare-bones sketch of the idea that I'm going to eventually lay out. Before getting back to the idea itself, I'm going to have to do some building. I've got to mold some bricks before I can begin to build the foundation. So I want to understand the origins of weird psychology. So how is it that when we looked at the global diversity across the world, how is it that Westerners so frequently ended up at the end of the distribution? And my story is going to start in an unlikely place. At least it's an unlikely place for most people. Although, if you're familiar with the historical or the anthropological literature, I'm drawing on existing lines of research. So the unlikely source is a particular brand of Christianity that in late antiquity began to adopt a series of prescriptions and prohibitions and taboos about who you could marry and the way you could organize your family and how you can do inheritance. When the Western Church, which eventually becomes the Roman Catholic Church, expands into Western Europe, it systematically demolishes the existing complex or intensive kin-based organizations. Now, if you're not an anthropologist, that might sound very strange, but these are things like clans and kindreds. These are webs, these are networks of related individuals where you have obligations and responsibilities to other members of your social network. These are ascribed or born into them. And then your survival, your self-identity, your legal identity, social safety net, all stems from these complex kinship systems, very common across anthropologically known societies. So the demolition of this kin group is going to contribute to this weirder psychology, and I'm going to probably spend most of my effort trying to make that link, to take a look at that green arrow. But what this does socially and psychologically is to open the door for new forms of social organization that otherwise would be very difficult to evolve given the pre-existing existence of these kin-based institutions. So people begin to form free associations, and initially these are religious groups that are formed for mutual aid. So things like guilds, which start that way, monasteries begin to proliferate, charter towns, people begin to move into urban areas, they move as individuals, and they become citizens of these small charter towns. Free cities begin to proliferate, and universities become another kind of voluntary association. Crucial in these voluntary associations is competition amongst voluntary associations. And one of the things I do in the book that I won't have time to do today is to draw a causal arrow from increasing the competition among all sorts of voluntary organizations to changes in psychology, increases in the kind of impersonal prosociality that Ernst discussed in his talk, and we saw it elsewhere. All right. Now, once you have those competing voluntary organizations, one of the things that is competing are these charter towns and free cities. They're competing for members. They want certain kinds of members, and they're given the best deal to get certain kinds of people. So you get rising urbanization, I'll show you a little data, and increased occupational choice. So rather than your occupation determined by your class or your caste or your clan, there's more opportunity for free choice, and that's going to have an effect. And the one I'll concentrate a little bit on, in addition to kinship, is the idea that impersonal markets affect our prosociality. And what you get in the rise in Europe is an increase in impersonal commerce, people making deals with strangers in order to conduct transactions. Okay. Now, to give you a sense of how I came at this, in 1994, I was heading off to do my first stint of field work. I'm trained in cultural anthropology, and I'm actually in a missionary plane, so that's kind of prophetic, that I've hired to fly me into this remote part of the Peruvian Amazon. This is the village of Camisea. And two things happened to me during this trip, or during my time working with the Machigenga, where I went back over the course of 4 years. During this trip, I got a dugout canoe, and I went 2 days travel up to the most remote village that I'd heard about. And I stayed in the village for a little while, and after a few nights there, in the darkness, over kerosene candlelight, some of the Machigenga folks in the village began to ask me some questions. One question they asked me was they knew I was an American, and they'd heard that Americans had been to the moon, so they wanted to know if I'd been there and what it was like. I explained that I hadn't been there, but I had a sense. And when they heard what it was like, they said, well, why would anyone want to go there? But then the next thing they said is, how come you Americans have so much and we have so little? How come you come to visit us and learn about us, but we can't go to learn to visit you? And I was a little stumped by this. I was a first-year graduate student at the time. I kind of cooked up an early version of an argument I later found in Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. So the idea that for some reason, processes of social change, the emergence of complexity, had occurred in different rates on different continents. But anyway, this question kept rattling around in my mind. During the same period, I began to study economic decision-making. And the MacArthur group that Ernst mentioned comes into play here. So I learned about something called the ultimatum game from the behavioral economists, including Ernst Fair and Colin Kammerer. So the following summer, I came back with the ultimatum game, which is a simple two-person bargaining game that, when done amongst undergraduates in Western society, seems to violate the basic predictions you would get from canonical versions of game theory. So selfish rational actors. And when I did it with the Machigenga, I got a very different result. Now, I quickly realized once I started talking about this result to my fellow cultural anthropologists that there was no chance I was going to be able to publish this in anthropology. So some of the papers I was reading as an anthropology graduate student was in the American Economic Review. So I sent it off to there. And it was actually published next to the article or the data that Ernst showed you in the 2000 issue. He showed the public goods game. So it's kind of a little historical parallel there. But this project spurred a second project in which we brought together a bunch of anthropologists and some experimental economists, and we found a lot of diversity in this game and also other similar behavioral games. We went on to do a second project which just sort of, again, showed this diversity with Western industrialized societies being at the end of the distribution. This is what I had in my mind when I first began to review the other evidence from my cultural ecologist friends. So now I'm going to talk about where that trajectory took me. But I did want to mention, we called our paper here, this was Sam Bowles' title, he's an economist, In Search of Homo economicus. We never found him. So all of the societies we studied violate the canonical predictions from economics. But I kept searching. And I would go on to team up with some primatologists. And we conducted similar experiments among chimpanzees. And we found Homo economicus. He's a chimpanzee. So there's been several experiments done, and chimps seem to zero in on the Nash equilibrium, even in dynamic games, interestingly enough. So that's just an interesting aside. Now, to get at this question, we had to begin to think about culture. And unfortunately, the way that many social science disciplines approach culture is they think about it as the residual. So after you've explained everything based on material constraints or land, labor, and capital, it's that extra stuff that you can't explain with material constraints. And this leads you with a kind of culture as a window dressing or a small phenomena that lies on the surface of these much deeper, harder, more important phenomena. And what part of the case I want to make today is that we need to take a different approach to humans. And so I've summarized and kind of reviewed the available evidence in my 2016 book, The Secret of Our Success. And that says that what we need to do is take an evolutionary approach to humans. The first thing you need to know about humans to explain a whole bunch of things, and this will actually come up as I go along, is that we're a type of ape. So if you want to understand why we're interested in social status, other apes are interested in social status, dominance. Why do we pair bond? Why is there marriage? Well, gorillas have pair bonding, and pair bonding seems to lie at the core of marriage. Why do we simultaneously love our brothers and sisters, our parents and our children, but find the idea of having sex with them completely disgusting? You would think those things might go together, but once you realize we're an ape, we actually use some of the same cues to figure out our inbreeding avoidance that's common to other primates. So that's the first thing. But humans are special, and that we've become a cultural species. So sometime before about 2 million years ago, humans became increasingly dependent on learning from other individuals. In fact, our brains seem to evolve to adaptively key in on some members of our social groups or to integrate information across minds. This happens early, so developmental psychologists can show these adaptive learning mechanisms operating by age 1. It's the basis for learning language. We learn how to make tools, shelters, but we also learn social norms. This process gives rise to gene-culture coevolution. So this is mainstream evolutionary biology now. So if you want to understand why our colons are the length they are compared to other apes, our stomachs, our teeth, our jaw muscles, the fact that we have resistance to the toxins in smoke, you need to understand that our genes have co-evolved with cultural evolution. Now, one of the things that you get for free, kind of in this ground-up approach, are social norms. So once you can learn the behavior or the motivation from others and the standards for judging others, Ernst mentioned that there's always consequences, so you have standards that get diffused in a group, then you get these self-reinforcing stable equilibria, where if anybody deviates, then they get sanctioned. This can stabilize all kinds of things. Norms can be arbitrary. So to give you one example, men in some societies wear colorful bands around their necks, and they cinch them up until they're almost choking. But then there are deeper norms which seem to tap aspects of our evolved psychology. So I'm going to give you some examples of those in a few minutes. Then from there you get institutions. So institutions are merely packages of social norms. Economists might want to call these informal institutions to distinguish them from written laws or constitutions. Now, the thing that I want to add in here is that because we're a product of gene-culture coevolution, we have this large cortex which is prepared to alter plastically to allow us to most effectively navigate the worlds we end up. And this could be navigating new kinds of technology, this could be navigating the incentives of different institutions, or it could be learning languages that require us to attend to certain kinds of information. All of these things shape our brains, and I'm talking about non-genetic shaping our brains. It can do it genetically in the longer run, but it does it ontogenetically in the short run. And our motivations. Okay, just to mention some innate anchors, because this is going to be important for understanding kinship systems. I mentioned the evolved psychology to help kin. This explains why across all traditional human societies, the fundamental institution is a kin-based form of organization. It extends our notion of kinship to people who are more distantly related, but it's built on this underlying piece of psychology. Marriage is also, it's nearly universal. There's one exception. Society that doesn't seem to have marriage. But in general, you find marriage underpinned by this pair bonding psychology, which is a physiological system. And finally, I mentioned incest aversion. But in lots of small-scale societies, you have incest taboos. And these taboos, they're not really concerned about your siblings. People in these societies aren't worried about siblings having sex. These are focused on your cousins. And they're suggesting you don't marry certain cousins or certain kinds of more distant relatives. It's a way of organizing social life. Okay, now in the scaling up of human societies, throughout most of our species' evolutionary history, we probably lived in small-scale hunter-gatherer bands that had extensive kinship. So there, the incest taboos and the marriage rules force people to make distant connections. And so they create a big social network so that if something happens locally, a shock, a famine, you can then find places to go. But as society scaled up and agriculture emerges, you have to control territory. And you get the beginning of these more intensive forms of kinship. So unilineal clans, where you just have patrilineal or matrilineal clans. You get notions of common ownership. Everyone in the clan owns this. You get inherited status, so your place in terms of ranking depends on your place in the kinship system, your age, and also ancestor worship. So the idea that we're all linked to this common ancestor gives us a sense of identity, which other people have talked about. So cultural evolution elaborates these to create units that can compete more effectively against other units, and so they outcompete bands. Now, there's many different pathways that this complexity evolution can take. So one thing is towards segmentary lineages, which is just a way of relating different clans together. There are age sets. If you do research in Africa, you probably know about these, although these pop up all over the world. These unite clans, and they create cross-cutting bonds. But the interesting pathway is the one that goes to states, and as far as we know, there's only one pathway. So simple chiefdoms, one clan becomes better than the other clans, they gain political power. Complex chiefdoms, now there's strata. One clan only marries with itself or other elite clans, and then there's a lower strata. And then finally, you get the emergence of states. Now, there are other pathways, that's what that was for. There are other pathways, but they don't seem to go up the complexity ladder. There can be lots of egalitarian, lots of competition, but you don't get this increasing scale. Now, this is important for what happened in Europe, because when you get the first states, they have intensive, complex kinship where people are enmeshed in these webs of interwoven relationships at both the elite strata, so the elites are all doing this, and then at the lower strata, they're all doing this. The place where you get state institutions are these non-relational institutions that are military, bureaucratic, judicial, that appear at the interface between the elite strata and everybody else. This means there's kind of a blockade, there's a path dependence here. You can't get to the kind of societies that eventually developed in Europe, those kinds of states, because you have this blockade of complex kinship. So by chance, the Western Church, of course, didn't know they were doing this, but their peculiar set of religious taboos that led to the diffusion wipes this out, and they systematically undermine it. And this takes hundreds of years, but we have a large record of it because the church likes to write stuff down. So every time they have a meeting, we know that they discussed incest legislation and what to do about polygyny and how we can change the inheritance system and topics like this. So by the time, before any economic growth begins, Europe has a simple kinship system. Nuclear families, inheritance through both sides. Couples have to live independent of mom and dad, no arranged marriages, no marrying relatives. I'll talk more about that. And the church begins to provide social safety nets to replace that, which would normally be from complex kinship. Psychology adapts to this world. This requires two quite different kinds of psychology. And so that's going to be the key thing I'm going to talk about in a minute. One thing people don't realize, so Europe had tribes. If you read Roman history, you know that. Where did the tribes go? Well, the boundary of a tribe depends on the marriage customs. As soon as you marry across tribal lines, you begin to dissolve those boundaries. The church's program inadvertently dissolves the tribes because you're forced to marry across tribal boundaries. And in a few hundred years, they go away. All right, and so then you can get new kinds of governments, new kinds of higher level institutions. So this is the thing people usually focus on when they're thinking about the rise of the West. For me, that's the end of the story. Then, the rest is history. All right, so just to tell you a little bit more about the marriage and family program. So this begins in late antiquity. The earliest documents documented around 305, 306 CE. 500, they begin the important bans on marriage to relatives. So first, it's first and second cousins, affinial relatives, so relatives through marriage get included, and God relatives. This goes out to 6 cousins by the end of the first millennia, and then in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, it's contracted back to just include third cousins. Bans on polygynous marriage, bans on arranged marriages, these are all taking tools out of the patriarch's tool chest for building these unilineal clans or corporate kin groups. No corporate ownership of land, inheritance by testament. I can talk, if people have questions about why these particular details, I'm happy to address that at the end. So now what I want to do is get to the empirical stuff. And I need to link the intensity of these kinship groups to psychological variation. And then I'm going to also go from the intensity of exposure to the Western Church to psychological variation. For this talk, I had to select a small subset of the psychological outcomes. So we're going to look at individualism, conformity, public goods contributions, impartial rule following, and impersonal trust. And the strategy here is to use different measures. So we want to use laboratory measures like behavioral experiments because they give us precision. We want to use survey measures because that allows us to look at tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And we want to use ecologically embedded measures because we want to make sure the other two actually cash out in the real world and aren't just measuring how people respond to surveys. Okay, now to measure this, if you look at the global surveys that are available, there's almost no information on kinship. And that's because the surveys are written by weird people. They're written by people who don't have the intuition that the family could be particularly important. But the people who do recognize that the family is probably very important are anthropologists. So here we drew in a database assembled by anthropologists in the 1950s called the Ethnographic Atlas. And it has lots of information about kinship because if you work in these small-scale societies as I have, the one thing that hits you sharply in the face is that kinship systems are hugely important. So there's data on cousin marriage, polygyny, clans, extended family. So we simply created an index that aggregates all this up. And the higher the index, the more intensive your kinship. Using linguistic data, we can map it to the world. And so this gives you a measure of the current kinship intensity based on heritage. So the average year in the Ethnographic Atlas is 1900. And we take modern populations and basically map it back to that. All right, there's a nice paper by one of my colleagues, Benjamin Anke, who's going to make similar connections. Our two papers show converging evidence using a similar approach. In addition to the Ethnographic Atlas, the data from the anthropologists, we also compiled data from biologists. So the biologist Alan Biddles has data on actual marriages around the world. And you can see that this is the cousin marriage data based on actual behavior, so what people do. And we're also going to make use of dispensation requests. So in Europe, this kind of data is hard to come by, but at least for a period in Europe, people had to ask for dispensations if they wanted to marry their cousins. So that can be used to approximate this. Okay, and then we also created measures of how long the church had been in control of a population. And we can do that within regions within Europe and the whole world. Okay, so this kinship part of the project, I have three important collaborators I want to acknowledge: Jonathan Schultz, Jonathan Beauchamp, and Duman Barani-Rod. All three of those guys are economists, so I will work with economists. Okay, so first I wanted to give you the cross-national approach. This gives you the broadest breadth and gives you a sense of global psychological diversity. And then we're going to zoom in on Europe. And we're actually going to show differences between European regions based on the details of church history. And then I'll zoom in on Italy, which is a particularly interesting case. So lots of researchers, including economists, have used this measure by the social psychologist Geert Hofstede, individualism. It's a survey measure that aggregates the degree to which people focus on their own self, on their own personal attributes, that they're concerned about achieving, themselves achieving, and how strong their links are to their family. So if they're weak, you're a bit more individualistic. This is a useful variable to connect with because a lot of research in psychology links it to understandings of the self, people's tendency to self-enhance, to promote themselves, to be overconfident of their own abilities is linked to individualism. The importance of self-esteem for mental health is related to individualism. And something called analytic thinking, so people can approach problems analytically or holistically. That's also linked to this. Another reason to be interested in it in terms of my second puzzle is that there's work in economics linking individualism to economic growth and particularly to innovation. So it seems like more innovative places are more innovative, although that link is not as well nailed down as would be ideal. Okay, so here's some of the first data. So here's my kinship intensity index. So clans, polygyny, and stuff up here. Individualism, so more intensive kinship, less individualism. More cousin marriage, less individualism. This is actually the weakest among our relationships. These are cross-national analyses, so you don't want to take them too seriously. They do illustrate the relationships we expect, though. We can control for all kinds of interesting ecological variables, geographic variables, pathogen stress, genetic heterogeneity, how long it's been since the Neolithic transition, so the origins of agriculture, potential for irrigation, and importantly, religion, religiosity, and religious denomination. So this is independent of those, or at least trying to hold those constant. All right, and then the duration of the church. So we're able to aggregate out to how long different countries around the world had been exposed to the Western Church, to the Roman Catholic Church. And so that's 1,000 years, and that's 100 years. And you can see that greater individualism, or longer exposure to this church, greater individualism. quite a strong relationship. It holds up to the same controls, statistical controls I gave you on the last page. Now, importantly, we always look at the Eastern Church whenever possible, because one obvious alternative would be maybe it's something that the church was bringing, like Roman institutions or Christianity, maybe it's belief in God, but what we find is it's always strong with the Western Church and weak with the Eastern Church, weak or non-existent. So that's kind of that provides us some control. Okay, now if you've taken a course in social psychology, you know about the Asch conformity test. This is the test that involves confederates, so you can't do the experiment in economics, but subjects come into the laboratory and they're asked whether this line, which of these lines is the same length? So this line, does it match A, B, C, or D? And they do a series of trials, they're throwing up different lengths lines, and then on 2 critical trials, sometimes it's more, they have the confederates of the experimenter give the same wrong answer, and then the subject's up. And the question is, how often does the subject go along with the other 2? And how often do they give what they would think is the right answer? Subjects get it right 97% of the time when they're by themselves. So they pretty much know the right answer. So the question is, how often do they conform? And what you see is people from societies with higher kinship intensity are much more likely to go along with the 2 people who went before them. So that's a 0.6 correlation. And then cousin marriage, similar relationship. And then duration of the church. Same kind of relationship, longer under the Western Church, lower amounts of conformity going along with the other guys. Ernst told you about the public goods game. So in case you didn't all see that, let me briefly describe this. So there's different ways to do this. So in this example, there's 4 players, anonymous to each other. They can contribute from 0 to 20 euros to a common pool. Whatever goes into that pool is increased, say by 40%, although it could be 50% or 60%, that doesn't matter. And then everything in the pool is divided equally amongst the group. So it's in the individual incentive to give the least and free ride on the contributions that come out of the public goods. So this was something like giving blood or making the air clean or something like that. So in the particular version of the experiment I'm going to show you here, the game is played for 10 rounds, but it has a finite end, with the same people. Real money's on the line, so everybody in different countries is going to face the same situation. And then there's also a version without punishment, which is what I just described, and then a version with punishment. And in that version, each round, you can pay money to take money away from the other players if you don't like what they did. Okay, so now same predictor variables, and this is the game without punishment. So it's the contribution in the first round. And I like the first round because it's kind of what the players bring into the game before they see what everybody else does in this game. Higher kinship intensity, lower cooperation. And you get the same thing for cousin marriage and the same thing for the Western Church, whereas the Eastern Church is weak and not clear that it's not 0. Now, this is the punishment treatment, and here, because punishment drives up cooperation over the rounds, we look at the average cooperation across groups. And what you see is that this system of using peer punishment works great if you have a low kinship intensity, but it doesn't work so great if you have a high kinship intensity. Why? Because people get punished, it really pisses them off, and they want to punish back. Now, they can't tell who they're punishing back, but they kind of strike back and hit the high contributors. So this causes cycles of violence, like clans have cycles of violence. So here the psychology seems inconsistent with the institution. And you get the same thing for cousin marriage and same kind of relationships with church exposure. Okay, this is the point I just made. This is a case where where the effectiveness of the institution, in this case it's a game institution, has to fit with the psychology of the population. Works great in some populations, mediocre in others, and actually bad in others. All right, now I mentioned when I was describing the various methods that we want to make sure these things pan out in the real world. So we gather data from the World Health Organization, so voluntary blood donations across different countries. And kinship intensity, people in countries with high kinship intensity give less voluntary donations. Now, this is a lot like the experiment in the sense that it's a public good, it's voluntary, and it's anonymous. So you're giving blood to someone you don't know and will never know who you are. Cousin marriage, same kind of relationship. And here we get a strong relationship with the Western Church and a somewhat weaker relationship with the Eastern Church. Yeah. Here we have a big enough sample that we can put in our host of controls And we can show that these are robust to these controls. All right, trust. There's been a lot of talk about trust. Tricky thing about trust, though, is the standard trust question, which is often relied upon, is misinterpreted in some societies. Because rather than saying trust in a generic stranger, it's interpreted to mean trust in the people who live around me, who in some places are my extended kin group and part of my kind of local in-group. So I prefer this approach, where you take 6 questions on more specific about trust. So you create an out-group measure of trust by asking, do you trust people who you meet for the first time, people of another religion, and people of another nationality? And you average those, that gives you out-group trust. And then you subtract trust in your family, neighbors, and people you know personally. And you subtract that, gets this difference. A good sanity check is, this is negative in every country. So people always trust their in-group more than their out-group. But how big that difference is in in-group, out-group trust varies a lot. So societies with more intensive kinship have a bigger difference between in-group and out-group. They're more likely to distrust people that they don't know. Same thing with cousin marriage and duration of the church. Similar relationship there. Here I actually made a mistake. This should have all the controls, not just this subset of geographic controls. Now, there is a literature in economics that Ernst made reference to in his talk that links trust to economic growth. So there's a reasonably good case to be made that if you can increase people's trust in generic strangers, that you can galvanize innovation and economic growth, getting more transactions, grow the economy more. So this link, I think, is out there and established. Not everyone believes it, but a lot of people do. So if we can just get this up, then the rest goes. Okay. Weird people are bad friends. Many may not be familiar with this set of experiments. It comes from sociology. If you're in a business school, you might. It's a vignette experiment. You're riding in a car with a friend, and your friend is driving. He's driving recklessly and kills a pedestrian. His lawyer tells you that if you testify that he was driving responsibly within the speed limit, he'll get off. Otherwise, he'll probably do prison time. So the question is, what do you do? Do you lie to help your friend? Loyalty to friends, that's a virtue. Or do you follow the law? Another virtue. So you have a virtue trade-off. And here on the vertical axis is the percentage of people who said they'd lie to help the friend, keep your friend out of jail. And higher kinship intensity, more willingness to lie to help the friend. Same thing with cousin marriage, even a stronger relationship. And church exposure, only the Western church, not the Eastern church. Okay, impersonal honesty. So this is work done by, well, I guess it's one of Ernst's former postdocs, Simon Gester, and one of my current postdocs, Jonathan Schiltz. So these guys did this around the world, and it's a simple experiment where you roll a die, you roll the die twice, and you report the first roll into the computer. Now, as you can see from the payoffs I've listed here, the higher you roll, the more money you get. So it's straight, there's no other people around. It's just you and the die. Except the 6, you get 0. So this gives us a measure of cheating, people's willingness to lie in order to get more money. And these measures, so this is the percentage of high claims. So these are rolls of 3, 4, and 5. We know from statistics that that should be 50%. Everybody is higher than 50%. So there's 50%. Everybody lies. But some places lie more than others, and so this is associated with corruption. That's what Jonathan and Simon showed. You can explain this with our kinship intensity index. So same measure, high claims, you get this strong relationship, cousin marriage, and church exposure. Again, small sample, so we don't include any of the controls there. Here, however, we can go to the real world. There's this famous study by Ted Miguel and Ray Fishman, in which they got the diplomatic parking tickets incurred by delegates from around the world to the UN. So everybody lives, well, 90% of them live within 1 mile of the UN. They're facing the same streets in New York, but they all have diplomatic immunity up until 2002. And so the question is, how many unpaid parking tickets do they get? They don't have to pay. You can see some of these irrational guys from Canada and Sweden get 0. But as the country you're from's kinship intensity index increases, you get more unpaid parking tickets. So this is the kind of measure that I think the dice rolling game also captures. You can do it for cousin marriage and church exposure. So the same patterns of results across lots of different data, And in this case, we have lots of observations, so we can use all these controls that we should worry about. Okay, now that is just a brief whirlwind tour through some of our evidence. So impersonal pro-sociality is what you've just seen. I showed you conformity. I could have also showed you survey measures of obedience and tradition. I could show you data from something called the Moral Foundations instrument. It's created by the psychologist Joe Henrich. That would tell the same story. Data from the Global Preferences Survey on third-party punishment tells the same story. I could show you measures of analytic thinking or field dependence. That's two different measures, one of thinking and one of perception that vary. The importance of guilt over shame follows the same pattern. The importance of intentionality in moral judgments. A lot of people find this unintuitive, but Westerners place great emphasis on whether a person meant to do it as whether they just did it. In lots of places, it only matters that you did it. It doesn't matter what was going on inside your head. And so we find that varies and can be explained by these patterns. Many of you are probably familiar with the heuristics and biases literature. Most of those biases vary dramatically across societies, and they're strongest in the West. So however important you think they are, they're less important, most likely, as we go around the world. Many of you might have heard of the Big Five personality dimensions. Those work great in industrial societies. In some places, they seem to have only 4 dimensions instead of 5. But if you go to small-scale societies, there's 2 dimensions, and they don't map onto any of the 5. So somehow these different personality dimensions emerge. And patience. So we've heard a bit about patience. That varies a lot. Okay, now this is interesting, given that, as I mentioned, over 90% of all the studies are done with people from westernized countries, what I would call weird people. So this is a problem for our understanding of humans. I'm actually going to skip this. The point I want to make on this slide is that our psychologies have to adapt to these very different worlds. One with an emphasis on social relationships and building those interconnections where your value depends on your relationships, and another world in which you're cultivating your own personal attributes, and you're going to move among relationships and you're kind of advertising or selling yourself. And that explains a bunch of the patterns that I've seen. Okay, so now let's zoom in on Europe. I'm going to use 4 measures from the European Social Survey. 1 measuring conformity and obedience, 1 measuring individualism and independence, a measure of impersonal fairness and impersonal trust. And so these are all measured on a 0 to 10 scale. Now, to get measures of cousin marriage in Europe, we use dispensations based on Vatican data. So prevalence of first cousin marriage is our measure. You can see that parts of Europe, so these are 68 regions scattered around Italy, France, Spain, and Turkey's also on there. So that's Turkey. More cousin marriage in the 20th century, lower on individualism and lower on impersonal fairness. You get the same thing for conformity and obedience, except now, impersonal trust. So the same usual relationships, except now we're comparing just regions within Europe, and similar thing. Not all of these relationships, I should say, for the economists will stand up to absorbing the differences among countries. They're not all widely scattered, so that's just a kind of caveat on how confident we should be. Finally, to get a measure of church exposure for Europe, we track the diffusion of bishoprics across Europe. And so we have a location and a date for each place. And you can see this is going up to 1,500, but I'll let it cycle through. And what we do is we take the location and we calculate its dosage by drawing a circle of 100 kilometers around each bishopric. And then that gives it a dosage, the number of years that it's been under the Catholic Church. We take into account if the area was conquered by, for example, in Spain by Islamic societies or in southern Italy. So you can see that diffusion. And when you do all that, you get the map that looks like this. So a lot of these areas had a great deal of exposure to the Catholic Church. You can see Italy is going to be interesting, Spain is interesting, and Eastern Europe is interesting. Okay, and what we find is that individuals from regions, so there's 442 regions in our analysis, a couple 100,000 people, show, if you had more church exposure, greater impersonal trust, greater fairness, greater individualism and independence, and less conformity. We're comparing regions within the same country, so we've absorbed away all the variation between countries. So nothing about national governments, national social safety nets can matter in this case. And then we include lots of individual demographics, geography, amount of education, prosperity in 1500 CE when our measure begins, presence of Roman roads, 1948 Iron Curtain, Carolingian political borders. And we can also do the analysis just for socialist Europe. So Western Europe has a different history. Let's just look at socialist Europe. Same answer. Then we use Alessandra's trick, the second generation immigrant trick, the epidemiological approach. So we draw out just the second generation immigrants from the survey, and we tack them, we give them a measure of their kinship intensity based on where their mom came from, where dad came from, or where the average of mom and dad came from. We can run it any of those ways, doesn't matter. Or we can take the language spoken in the home and attach them to cousin marriage and kinship intensity using that. And when we do that, greater kinship intensity leads to less impersonal trust, less impersonal fairness, more conformity and obedience, and less individualism and independence. And these are people who grew up in Europe their entire lives. So they're only being connected through this link through their parents. Okay, and we can hold together lots of interesting individual level controls. I'll point to here the feeling of being discriminated against. So we include that, it's available in the survey. And also religiosity and religious denomination. So that doesn't seem to be what's going on. So whatever it is the Christians or the church was doing, it wasn't about things captured by these variables. All right, so this doesn't, if you're an economist, this makes you a little bit happier. You might not be delighted. It only eliminates plausible alternatives. Let me just quickly zoom in on Italy. So Italy is interesting because the Carolingian Empire ended here. And northern Italy then had a very different amount of church exposure than southern Italy. Sicily is controlled by Islamic societies. This is a checkered history here, including control by the Orthodox, the Byzantine Empire, the Orthodox Church. This is a blood donations measure, so paralleling our cross-country results. And what we find is higher cousin marriage in Italy, so 93 provinces in Italy, fewer voluntary blood donations, more corruption, higher likelihood of these political organizations, these medieval communes. People take more loans from friends, not banks, more cash, and they use fewer checks. All this stuff indicating less trust. So that you can zoom all the way down to Italy and still find these patterns of variation. Okay, I started here. I just want to show you one more causal linkage. I think markets matter. And remember I said that people are freed up from the complex kinship groups so they can migrate as individuals to European towns. Here's the urbanization rate growing. So there's 800, 900. It's actually around 800, it's 0.5%. So there it is at about 900. And then urbanization rates just keep growing. Much of this are towns that are either charter towns at the beginning or they become charter towns. And you can see the city and corporations here growing rapidly and market grants. So higher level political elites are granting these well, they want these charter towns and they also wanted to have markets because it generates cash flow. So they figured out, how to use it, but ultimately it undermines the whole operation. So this is what's going on in the ground. So this anchors us in history. Now I want to find out what effect would these kind of markets have on people's psychology. So there's several papers that show this relationship I'm about to tell you. I like this work by Devish Roshtagi. So Devish studied the Bale, Oromo, in Ethiopia. So this is one ethnic group. They're pastoralists. They live in patrilineal clans. They have age sets, so like standard complex kinship. But in this place, people are tethered to their land by customary land rights. So they can't move around. That eliminates a possibility that people are migrating to be closer to the markets. And this is the distance to the market. So this is number of hours. And Devish did a two-person public goods game that allows him to measure the people's willingness to give cooperation and reply to cooperation with cooperation. So the degree to which they're conditional cooperators, they're observing that norm. And if you're close to the market, lots of conditional cooperators, almost 90% conditional cooperators. If you're far, 5 hours away, most people are not going to the market very frequently, much lower on the conditional cooperation. The thing I like about Devish's study is he makes this link, but then he shows that groups that have higher impersonal prosociality are better able to form voluntary associations to monitor pastoral and conservation activities, to keep the trees so as to maintain the local environment. And they do it by monitoring and punishing. So if you have a different psychology, you're better able to make these voluntary associations, these cooperatives work. All right, now back to history. So data from the economist Gary Richardson suggests that even by 14th century England, most English folk were within 2 hours of the market, or 3 hours at most. Where does that put you? Right there. So if theory is true, they had a different psychology. They would have been more impersonally pro-social and better able to build certain kinds of institutions. Now, they would have been terrible at making clans, but they would have been better at making other kinds of institutions. All right. Now, eventually, some bright young economist is going to show up in my office and explain to me how we're going to get historical data to test this, and that's been happening lately. But until then, we can look at observers of the time. So people like Adam Smith and David Hume and the Baron Montesquieu actually observed this process in action. In fact, the Scottish philosophers were particularly in a good place to see this because southern Scotland is urbanizing. Eventually, it's going to have industrial revolution not too long after this. But meanwhile, there's hunter-gatherers in the north of Scotland, there's pastoralists, and then there's subsistence farmers. So they can see this entire spectrum of lifeways all within the postage stamp that's Scotland. So they report this, and you'll see some quotes at the very end. Okay, so let me give you some take-home messages. The first take-home message here is that we're a cultural species, so we're an ape that learns from others. Our minds have been adapted to, from a very young age, drink in ideas, beliefs, and values. And this shapes our brains. It shapes how we think of the world, what we pay attention to, and how we perceive things. So any effort to build a social science that takes culture seriously should recognize the cultural species. All right. Institutions are created by cultural evolution. I don't like it when people say it's either cultural institutions because the rules that guide our behavior are themselves fundamentally cultural. We learn them from other people. All right. Now, I'll just lecture economists, but the structure of economics means that there's a blind spot for kin-based institutions because so many economists come from societies not with clans and kindreds and complex institutions. So they don't tend to think families are very important, and they certainly don't think religion's important. And in my study, and not just in this paper, but elsewhere, I didn't come with the idea that religion's important. It just shows up and seems to make its way into my data. So institutions in psychology co-evolve to fit together. And that means you can't transplant an institution easily because you're going to get an institution, a formal institution like a constitution or a certain way of doing the judicial system, because it's got to fit with the underlying psychology. Psychology is not fixed. You can't assume preferences exogenous, for example. And of course, the current psychology deeply influences what comes next because it influences what appeals to people. You can see this in Western law. So by the 13th century, Western law already has a kind of individualist tilt. The individual is the key. Intentionality matters a lot. Science, it's basically an application of analytic thinking versus holistic thinking. Representative governments, same kind of reflection of a psychology that preceded their creation. All right. And then, so my final pitch would be, I think efforts to understand the role of cultural and economics means that economics needs to become an evolutionary historical science that tries to understand how and why historical processes unfold in particular ways, and also include an understanding of psychology. So an integrated social science, I guess, is the call. And finally, I'll close with there's two quotes I mentioned from Montesquieu and Adam Smith. Thanks for listening.